Thank you everyone for standing by, and welcome to our webinar entitled Do Islands Help Birds Migrate Across Lake Erie? This webinar series is called Freshwater Science. We'll highlight Ohio Sea Grant and partnering scientists every month. Every quarter is a different focus, from human health and fish farming to harmful algal blooms and human decision-making, bringing applied research to the public on issues that affect our Lake Erie communities. I am Jill Gentis-Banicki from Ohio Sea Grant and Stone Laboratory, and joining me today is Dr. Werner Bingman from Bowling Green State University. Dr. Bingman is a distinguished research professor within the Department of Psychology at Bowling Green State University. His research focuses on animal navigation and how the brain controls navigational behavior. He does so by mostly working with homing pigeons, migratory birds, and whip spiders, with a special interest in hippocampus and its comparative organization across vertebrate groups. That interest in that hippocampus nurtures additional research into memory processes. Dr. Bingman has been at Bowling Green since 1989 and teaches courses in ornithology and cognitive neuroscience. We're delighted to have Dr. Bingman here today to talk about his Sea Grant research. Before we do that, just a few things about the webinar itself. During our presentation, all participants will be in a listen-only mode. Afterwards, around 12:20, I will conduct a question and answer session. If you would like to ask a question during the presentation, please feel free to pull up that chat feature located at the bottom of your screen at any time during his talk, and I will collect and pose your questions out to Dr. Bingman at the end of his presentation. As a reminder, this webinar has auto captioning and is being recorded to be posted onto our website for later viewing. Also, we will post a webinar survey in the chat feature toward the end of the half an hour. Please take a few minutes after the webinar to fill out that survey. It will help us continue to bring you great webinars. So without any further delay, I'd like to introduce Dr. Bingman presenting Do Islands Help Birds Migrate Across Lake Erie?
Jill, thank you very much for that kind introduction.
You are on.
Okay, fantastic. Again, thank you again for the kind introduction. And let me, before I forget, say that that my lab and I are very much grateful to the support that we get from Ohio Sea Grant to do some of the things that we do. Right, so thank you. So anyway, this is a real marvelous opportunity for me to share some of the research that we've been doing, looking at the flight paths, the flight directions of migratory birds as they interact with Lake Erie. And we'll go ahead and move forward with this. So let me start out the conversation. And again, I have to be cognizant of the time because I think I've over-prepared things. But historically, patterns of bird migration in North America have kind of emphasized the existence of these so-called flyways. And many of you are probably familiar with these classical flyways, many of which are were developed in the context of waterfowl migration, more so than perhaps songbird migration. Okay. And the idea is that birds follow relatively predictable paths during their seasonal migrations between northern breeding sites and southern overwintering sites. And again, for the most part, this research has been, emphasizes that these birds are relatively reflexive agents, that they have a preferred migratory direction, for example, flying east of north or west of south. Okay, and they basically fly in this direction. They're up in the sky, and they're essentially indifferent to the topography that they're flying over. And you could kind of see this in certain patterns. So, for example, what you're looking at here is some Doppler radar images. So a lot of the migration research that has taken place in the last 30 years or so has taken advantage of the development and distribution of these Doppler weather stations that, of course, are used principally to predict weather movements, but they also can detect movements of migratory birds. So, for example, if you look at this map right here of the central United States, this was a night in May in 2022, where you could see there was a massive migration. This is the yellow and the orange areas, a massive migration through kind of the Mississippi River Valley. Okay, again, emphasizing kind of consistent with this notion of these flyways that we've been talking about. Okay, and If you actually look at the raw data, this is a couple of images, and these are just kind of fun, but this is actually a radar image taken from Doppler radar in Cleveland, showing a fall migration over Lake Erie, spreading from Cleveland towards Erie to the east and Toledo to the west. These green areas are actually birds. It's not weather, it's not clouds. These are actually migratory birds that are moving towards the radar site in Cleveland. The redder regions are the birds that are flying away from the weather sites in Cleveland. And again, this Doppler radar information has kind of revolutionized how we can study the broad front movements of migratory birds. Okay, just to kind of have fun with this. This is spring migration in Cincinnati, for those of you who might be in that part of the state. Again, the idea is red is moving away from the radar, green is moving towards the radar. So this is a spring migration with the birds moving kind of in a northeasterly direction. And again, these are indicators of broad front movements. So these kind of average movements. But what my interests are is actually the behavior of individual birds and how individual birds may interact with underlying topography and the extent to which birds are actually making decisions on how they interact with features such as mountains or lakes or coastlines and things like that. So to study individual birds in contrast to these broad front movements, what we've been relying on are these infrared cameras. And this is a busy little slide here, but this is the example of the infrared camera that we've been using. Infrared cameras, of course, are picking up heat signals. So migratory birds that are flying at night are generating a heat signal, and the infrared cameras can pick those up. And we can actually then see migratory individual birds pass through the field of these infrared cameras and actually record the individual directions of the birds, right? So not these broad front average movements that you might get from Doppler radar, but rather what individual birds are doing and how the behavior of individual birds, in particular how they orient in space, may vary as they encounter various topographic features. Okay, so this is just a little details here. So we're going to move on. Just to give you a sense of what you actually see through these infrared cameras, you can see this little migratory bird moving here. It's on its fall migration, just to give you a sense of what these things look like. Here's a spring migration movement. That bird moved a little bit more quickly. You see, boom, there it goes. It's a repetition of the same thing. Boom, there it goes. We give you a sense of what you actually see through those cameras. Okay, all right. So what we did, this research actually started, before we started doing the work on Middle Bass Island, we actually started looking at what effect the coastline, in particular the coastline topography of Lake Erie, might have on the decision of migratory birds to cross Lake Erie or not cross Lake Erie. So Lake Erie, like many of the Great Lakes, can be considered a topographical barrier. Water is dangerous for some birds, especially birds that are migrating at night. So the question then becomes, is especially in spring migration, as these birds are migrating, coming up from the south, they're going to reach the shore of Lake Erie. And, the typical idea is that Lake Erie is not a terribly large body of water to cross. What is it, maybe 50 kilometers to cross Lake Erie if you go from Ottawa to, say, maybe Point Pelee or something like that? It's not the Gulf of Mexico, for example, but it is still significant, and dangerous weather patterns could create real problems for a bird that finds itself, 10 kilometers from shore. So are these birds going to interact, or are they behaving in an adaptive way when they reach the coast of Lake Erie during the spring migration? And we generate these kinds of data, and we compare that with control areas, so away from Lake Erie and what the broad front is moving. There are various comparison things. So I want to just do this relatively quickly. And what we're looking at here are flight patterns of birds. So if you look at these graphs, and we're seeing lots of these, each of these black dots is the direction of a single bird. Okay, it's a direction of a single bird in this top diagram. On the bottom diagram, okay, is the average of a nightly mean. So each of the black dots on the bottom diagram, these three circles here, is what was the average direction of the birds flying on a particular night. Okay, and what the individual bearing data show you here is that many of these birds, so you can see the coastline topography behind there. This is Cedar Point. Okay, and this is the Ottawa region. Okay, the Ottawa region. And what you could see is that if you look at the broad front movement, what the Doppler radar is telling you, the Doppler radar is telling you that most of the birds in the region are moving northeasterly, okay, or a little bit east of north would be better said. But at Cedar Point in Ottawa, there is a substantial westward shift or westward deviation, with many birds choosing to fly parallel to the coastline as opposed to crossing the lake. Okay, so let me rephrase that. Okay, certainly many migratory birds are crossing the lake. It's not that huge of an obstacle. Okay, but it would appear that at least for some of these migratory birds, when they're reaching the lakeshore, they're making the decision not to cross the lake. In other words, not to continue in that east-northeasterly direction, but rather to shift their individual migratory flights westward to parallel the coast. And this is really extraordinary, right? Because it's kind of demonstrating that these birds are not passively flying in a particular direction and being indifferent to the underlying topography, but they're rather active agents that are making decisions when certain topographical barriers are being reached. Some birds making some decisions, other birds making other decisions, but there's this considerable inter-individual variability. This can actually be seen more dramatically in this top figure here, where you can compare these migratory directions from Cedar Point. Okay, we have a topography that will lead the birds towards the west, and two different regions. So this is Maumee Bay, and you can see the coastline at Maumee Bay is oriented east-west. So there's no kind of leading line in any particular direction. And what you have over here is Bowling Green. And again, this is in spring migration. And if you look at Bowling Green, it sits over here. Okay, and what you could see is that at Cedar Point, there's a clear shift of the individual bearings that are more in alignment with the orientation of the coastline, with many birds choosing to fly along the coastline. In contrast, if you look at Bowling Green as well as Maumee Bay, the prevailing direction of movement is consistent with what's going on the broad front as measured by the Doppler radar, where the birds are moving a little bit east of north. Okay, so this is actually remarkable. I mean, Maumee Bay and Cedar Point are what, maybe 5 kilometers away from each other, distant from each other, yet the pattern of migration at Cedar Point is distinctly different from the pattern of migration that you're getting at Maumee Bay. And that difference can be explained entirely by the birds responding to the coastline and choosing not to cross Lake Erie so much at Cedar Point, more likely to cross Lake Erie from Maumee Bay because you don't have a coastline which is aligned a little better with the actual migratory direction. So these birds are really active agents. Many of these birds are active agents that are making these decisions. And I find that really quite extraordinary. Okay, now, the other reason why we can kind of understand this as being adaptive is that these patterns are going to interact with wind. Okay, so for example, what you're looking at here is that a lake crossing under conditions of easterly and westerly winds along the coast of Lake Erie. And what you can see is that under easterly winds, okay, when a coastal, not crossing the lake and paralleling the coastline would be more adapted because the winds will assist the birds, you get a much more pronounced coastline orientation compared to westerly winds. In other words, when the winds are favorable for a flight that deviates from the broad front direction and is more aligned with the direction of the coastline, the birds will actually, they're more likely to follow the coastline with those easterly winds than compared to westerly winds. So not only are these birds attending to topographic features, but they're attending topographic features in the context of the prevailing wind conditions and using those prevailing wind conditions to make decisions about when it's adaptive to not cross Lake Erie and follow the coastline along here. Okay, this is, again, Cedar Point, this is Ottawa, and when not to. And again, so again, they're taking a lot into account. They're looking at the topography. Winds are being assessed, or at least how they're drifting with respect to the ground is being assessed, and the birds are making active decisions on whether to not to cross Lake Erie or not. Okay, so we won't look at this. Okay, we won't look at this data from the fall migration because we're running out of time, and what you guys are interested in the islands. So acknowledging that these birds are sensitive to topographic features and acknowledging that birds will cross Lake Erie, the question then becomes, to what extent might the island archipelago in the western basin of Lake Erie be exploited by birds to somehow calibrate their flight across Lake Erie? Okay, so again, here's a little map of Lake Erie, and here's the island archipelago. And in the particular study of interest is that we have a field station, and this is research carried out by a current graduate student, Murphy Harrington. She's on Middle Bass Island. And what we're trying to compare is how birds might be orienting when they're flying over the island archipelago compared to a control site. And our principal control site is in Bowling Green, Ohio. So you have a location where there is a robust topographical leading line. That robust topographical leading line, again, is this kind of north, somewhat east of north arrangement of the island archipelago. Okay, as you move from Catawba and Sandusky to Point Pelee on the Canadian coast. And Bowling Green, which is essentially featureless. I don't know if you know Bowling Green, but like much of Ohio, it's topographically featureless. There's really no leading lines or patches of cities and lights and things like that, but nothing is pronounced, right? And if you ever take a plane ride over Lake Erie, you'll pick up immediately, right? You can see the islands all lit up and it's surrounded by dark. And it's really kind of fascinating. So what I want to share with you are preliminary results from the fall of 2022. Okay, and specifically what we were interested in is determining whether or not these birds can be using the island archipelago to compensate for wind drift. And this is kind of captured on this illustrative slide. But and what is captured here, and I realize I'm getting a little bit short on time, but it's not terrible yet. But what we're looking at here is the distinction between the track that the bird flies and the heading that a bird flies, right? So the heading is basically the directions the bird is pointing towards, its body axis is pointing towards, and that can be considered its principal flight direction. And in the absence of any wind, the heading direction and the track direction will be identical. But in the presence of wind, the actual track of the bird, its actual flight path, will be the summed effect of the bird's flight and its heading, as well as the effect that the wind has on that. So there are contributing vectors. So for example, in this example, you have wind blowing, you have the bird heading easterly, but the wind is blowing northeasterly, and the bird then will actually move over the ground in a kind of compromised direction, kind of east-northeast. The point here is that birds are subjective to wind drift. And wind drift will lead birds to fly in a path which deviates from their preferred path. Now, in principle, migratory birds can compensate for wind drift by altering their heading. And this is the example here. So the birds, again, want to move east in this little figure. Okay. And now they're able to compensate for the wind contribution to their track by altering their heading. So you see the heading now shifts somewhat more southerly, but if you combine that southerly heading shift with the wind, the actual track the bird will fly will be a direction towards the goal. So the question is, to do this, you need some kind of reference. You need to reference your preferred heading direction with some kind of topographical feature. And one of the questions that we're asking with this Lake Erie work is, can the island archipelago be exploited by migratory birds to compensate for wind drift? In other words, right. So let's take a look. So this is kind of the setup here. So this is Murphy. She's setting up her infrared camera. This is actually a more modern infrared camera. You can see it's kind of new. It's kind of smaller. It's actually kind of better. Right? She's setting herself up on an evening. This would be last fall. Okay. We've also have data from spring, but those spring data are still being analyzed. And these are not the best pictures in the world, but I want to highlight here, and it looks like my timing is going to work out almost perfectly. Let's look at this figure right here. So this is fall migration 2022. And I want to look specifically at these directions here. So what you're looking at, and I apologize for this being relatively small, but what you have here is Bowling Green to the left, and you have Middle Bass Island to the right. Okay. And each of these dots is the nightly mean direction, of the birds as they fly. Okay. And what you're seeing here is that what I want you to pay attention to, which is actually kind of interesting, it really is look at the spread in the nightly mean directions of these fall migratory birds. So each of these dots is the mean direction on a given night, and you have spread that runs from almost westerly to what is robustly southeast. So there's a lot of nightly variation. And these are the same nights, by the way. So these are each of these dots on the left, you have a corresponding same night on the right. Now take a look at Middle Bass Island, right? And the assumption is, by the way, before I forget, the assumption is that this variation in flight directions that you're seeing in Bowling Green is going to depend on wind. Okay, so this kind of larger westerly movement would have been associated with a strong easterly wind. This larger easterly movement would have been associated with a stronger westerly wind. But take a look at what's going on in Middle Bass Island. This is actually extraordinary. Okay, you have a tightness in their bearings. It seems as if, okay, there's a little bit of variation, but the variation in nightly mean directions is considerably smaller from Middle Bass Island compared to Bowling Green. Okay, the statistics would bear that out if we had a larger sample size, but this is remarkable. And this is basically consistent with the idea, okay, this is consistent with the idea that these birds are able to exploit the island archipelago to compensate for wind drift, to maintain a track direction that corresponds to the preferred direction, by altering their heading. Obviously, they would need to alter their heading, but they're continuing to go in this more or less the same geographic direction with a relative insensitivity to being drifted by the wind. An ability that is diminished or doesn't even exist when similar birds are flying over Bowling Green on those same nights. And again, this is for me, this is very exciting. We could also look at this. This is not a complete figure, and again, I apologize for some of the quality of these images, but these are actually individual bearings. So again, let me remind you that this is nightly means. You take the average of a specific night. These are the nightly means, and this is a little bit kind of messy, and it doesn't show everything that I'd like it to show. But what I would like to highlight here is if you look at the individual bearings, this is Middle Bass Island, and there's a strong concentration that runs from a little bit west of south to even a tinier bit east of south. And it's just a much larger spread. I mean, look at this spread. You're going from southwest to southeast. Okay, so there's a much larger spread in the individual bearings on the same nights. Again, these are birds being recorded on the same nights from the two locations. So both at the level of nightly mean directions as well as the level of individual bearings, what we're seeing is considerably more scatter at Bowling Green, and that scattering of flight directions at Bowling Green is entirely consistent, again, with these birds being able to exploit the island archipelago as a reference to compensate for wind drift. And again, for me, that's a very exciting result, because again, it intimates that these birds, again, are active agents, that they're actually responding to these topographical features, exploiting these topographical features in an adaptive way. Okay. Again, I know I'm out of time, but just very briefly, all this research, both the earlier research along the coast of Lake Erie and the current research on Middle Bass Island, is all done in the context of the policy decisions that are being made with respect to wind turbine development on Lake Erie. Now, I have to be perfectly honest with you. I am not currently up to date on exactly what is going on with the planned development of wind turbines out off of Cleveland. I do know that there was a consortium that was planning to set up experimental wind turbines at Lake Erie. That was then stopped by some kind of court injunction, which was then later liberated. So the interests, right, the commercial interests that would like to put wind turbines in Lake Erie, I think now have legal clearance, have judicial clearance to build the 6 experimental turbines outside of Lake Erie. I do not know, to be honest with you, if they are proceeding with those. You know, I assume that these kinds of initiatives, these commercial initiatives, assess governmental, the risks of governmental intervention. But nonetheless, there certainly are continued conversations, at the very least, about wind turbine development in Lake Erie. And certainly the kind of research that we're carrying out at Middle Bass Island could inform, in theory, policymakers. Again, I am not advocating for wind turbines. I am not promoting wind turbines here, nor am I, arguing against them. What I do know is that there is variation in the distribution of migratory birds along Lake Erie. And if one is going to place wind turbines that are a potential threat to migratory birds, as well as resident birds like bald eagles and things like that, then clearly decisions have to be made about where those wind turbines should be placed to minimize any potential harm to birds. And the one thing I am confident in saying, and I will say this to anyone that asks me, the development of wind turbines anywhere near the island archipelago would be an environmental tragedy, because you have a large concentration of migratory birds. Of the birds that cross Lake Erie, there's a large concentration of those birds that will use the island archipelago as a reference system to kind of compensate for wind drift and other kinds of disruptive effects during migration. So again, the idea of building wind turbines anywhere within the region of the island archipelago would be an environmental disaster. And I would, to the extent that anyone is listening to me, and who knows if anyone's listening to me, this certainly would not be something that one would do. But anyway, again, the point is that these data that we're collecting is certainly relevant for these conversations on wind turbine development. And again, I apologize for not being current on just exactly where things are right now. I just know it's been bouncing around the courts, and to the best of my understanding, the commercial interests can now build the turbines off the coast of Lake Erie if they choose to do so. And with that, I've only gone a little bit over, which is not too bad, but just very briefly, I want to again sincerely thank Ohio Sea Grant for enabling us to do this research on Middle Bass Island. And in particular, I'd like to thank 4 graduate students that at some level or another have contributed to the work that I described to you. That would be Ian Anderson, David Gazicki, who actually did the coastal Lake Erie work. Murphy Harrington is currently doing the Middle Bass Island work, and Jeremy Ross worked years ago and actually helped us get money to do some of the early work, some other things that we've done on the coast of Lake Erie. So with that, I want to thank you guys, wherever you are, whoever you are, for your patience. Again, being 4 or 5 minutes over. I certainly do a lot worse most of the time. So with that, Jill, I'm going to say, okay, I'm giving it back to you, and I apologize for going a little bit over.
No, you're fine. You're fine. This was great information, so we really appreciate it. Let me see here. We've gotten quite a few questions. So let me just get started here. Can you talk a little bit about, we got a lot of questions dealing with bird species.
Sure.
Which species, this question specifically was which bird species are choosing to avoid the lake crossing?
Okay, so the infrared cameras do not really enable us to identify the species that we are looking at, to be very clear. We make guesses based on the time of year that we're being recorded. So for example, there are certain bird species that will be more common in early September. There will be other species that will be more common in middle of October. Okay. There are certain software programs that can use wing beat detail to kind of enable you to identify the species of interest. What I could simply say is that with respect to the speeds and the flight patterns of the birds that we are looking at, we are overwhelmingly looking at songbirds. So this time of year, right now, early September, there's going to be warblers. There'll be some Swainson's thrushes. Okay, later on in the year, the sparrows will start showing up. Hermit thrushes will start showing up. What I would also add is that there is a range limitation to the infrared cameras. So their upper limit is about 1,000 feet above sea level, right? Or ground level, I guess would be the way you'd say it. So we're not getting higher birds. And the faster, bigger birds, shorebirds and waterfowl. So certainly shorebirds are migrating now in big numbers, but they tend to fly relatively high and they tend to be relatively fast. Waterfowl will follow. Again, they tend to fly relatively higher. So we are probably not picking up any shorebirds or any waterfowl because they will tend to fly higher. Okay. And having said all of that, just from an energetic perspective and a speed perspective, so that shorebirds and waterfowl, for example, tend to migrate at faster speeds than songbirds. So a lake crossing for them becomes less of a dangerous proposition, okay, because they can cross it more quickly. So again, there's a lot of considerations. There are ways of assessing it. For example, we've done some research using auditory. We've actually listened to the calls. So these songbird migrants will actually make calls during migration. Swainson's thrush is probably being the most distinctive. And David Gizicki actually has done some, published a paper where he used the flight call characteristics to identify which species of birds are migrating. He put actually these audio recorders out in Lake Erie. So he had one out in Cleveland. He had one out in Toledo. So again, these songbirds are crossing. Like, I'm not saying they're not crossing. I want to be clear here. It's not like these songbirds reach the lake and say no. Okay, no, lots of these birds are crossing, which is why the island archipelago is so important. And we do know that sparrows and warblers and thrushes will cross, but a lot of these birds are choosing not to cross. Okay. And the important point, the new message, the reason why I'm here, and I'm thanking Ohio Sea Grant and Jill for this opportunity, is that we now know that those songbirds that do crossing are exploiting, seem to be exploiting the island archipelago to kind of sustain their preferred migratory direction.
All right, well, thank you. We've gotten, let me see, a couple of questions dealing with, here's one question. Does fitness of the individual birds contribute to their ability to track or fly and compensate for wind drift? Do different species handle wind differently?
Okay, that's an actually interesting question. So I assume then the term fitness here is kind of the physical health of the bird and not the evolutionary concept of fitness. Okay. And of course, that is an enormously important question that brings into the conversation things like stopover sites and stopover habitat. So these birds are a migration is energetically very costly. Okay, migration is energetically very costly. Okay, and so the taking on a risk, like, as modest as Lake Erie may be, it is a risk crossing Lake Erie. And the question is, does energetic state of the bird come into play here? So again, these birds will put on a lot of fat, and when they get too skinny, they will actually suspend migration. So the birds that are migrating are all relatively fit. They all have enough fat deposits to energize. okay, to feed their migratory flights. Oh, and when they're not fat enough, when they don't have enough fat deposit, they basically stay where they are. So they'll make rather than take on a long distance migration on a night, they will stay where they are and just eat until they can accumulate enough energetic resources to then progress with their migrations. But we did look at something, okay, and this goes back to David Gizicki's work, again, not on Middle Bass Island. What he did is he compared the percentage of birds that seem to be paralleling the coast compared to the percentage of birds that are crossing the coast early in the evening when the birds are presumably fitter, compared to later in the evening, okay, after the birds have migrated. So the birds that are crossing Lake Erie at 3 in the morning have already migrated 5, 6, 7 hours. They've already depleted their fat resources. Are they less likely later in the evening to cross Lake Erie than the birds earlier in the evening? And what David found is that from one of his locations, the probability of a bird flying over the lake was reduced later in the evening compared to earlier in the evening. So what that suggests is that the energetic state of the animal, later migrating birds, 3 in the morning birds, they are presumably going to be under greater energetic stress, and they are more likely to make the decision to parallel the coastline compared to birds that are migrating at 9 in the evening, when presumably they're under less energetic stress. So yeah, it's relevant. So certainly, and this is true, there's a vast, for what it's worth, there's a vast body of research that has been done on the Gulf Coast, the Gulf of Mexico, where again, the over water crossing is dramatically more dangerous, dramatically more energetically costly. And there, that cost benefit analysis between progressing on your migration and making sure you're fit enough to manage an overwater crossing like the Gulf of Mexico becomes substantially more problematical.
All right, thanks. We got a couple of questions about the turbines.
Sure.
And one clarifying question is the issue with the turbines, is the issue that the birds might follow the turbines and mess up their navigation, or that the birds land on the islands and will fly through the turbines and be harmed?
Okay, right. Okay, so the principal idea is that this is kind of interesting, but the threat of the turbines is collisions. Okay, that's the and again, most of the migrants are flying higher than the tops of the turbines, but if they're on the island, certainly birds are landing on the islands, they're landing on the coastline. They are the threat of bird turbine collision is substantial. Okay, are wind turbines the most dangerous thing that migratory birds encounter? Probably not. Probably city lights are probably vastly more dangerous than wind turbines. But as I was talking to someone the other day, right? Okay, saying that wind turbines are not as dangerous as the lights of Chicago is a factual statement. Okay, but that doesn't deny the fact that these wind turbines will cause mortality in birds beyond what they would be if those turbines didn't exist, right? I mean, that's axiomatic. And these are decisions that policymakers have to make. I mean, again, especially the western basin of Lake Erie, it is bird tourism is an economically important asset during in western basin of Lake Erie. I mean, the whole McGee Marsh, warblers in May, big week thing is a real economic boost to the area. These are all things that need to be considered, right? But just on a side note, because the question was asked, I actually did so Bowling Green has 4 little wind turbines, and they're mostly dysfunctional. But I did an experiment, okay, with homing pigeons to see if maybe homing pigeons, while they're using landmarks to navigate, could they possibly be using the turbines to support their navigation? Okay, and the answer turned out to be yes. So if you wanted to ask the side question, beyond turbines being a threat to the birds in terms of collisions, but if you don't collide with them, could they potentially be exploited as a ground reference to compensate for wind drift? And the answer to that is probably yes. I mean, I'm not using that to advocate for the development of wind turbines. Please, that's not what I'm saying. But if you're simply asking the purely curiosity question, could the birds use these turbines to kind of compensate for wind drift, just like they're using the islands to compensate for wind drift? The short answer is yes, at least in the case of homing pigeons, right? But anyway, but again, just to not lose the point. The big problem is collisions.
All right. One person asked whether or not with your infrared imagery, are you also recording audio at the same time?
No, no.
Okay.
No, the
Okay.
audio recordings we did, that was years ago, that David did the audio recordings, that was years ago, and those were independent of any visual identification. Now, on a side note, this whole research program actually started with some generous support through I don't remember where it was, but it came through Marcy Kaptur's office, and now Marcy Kaptur became involved, and of course, she's very interested in the ecological well-being of the Western Basin of Lake Erie. And we actually were this research, we were working in collaboration with a group of engineers at the University of Toledo. Okay. And they were developing a clever way of interfacing both radar observations, individual bird observations, as well as auditory observations from these birds, so that you could see a bird go through the infrared camera, and that would be interfaced with the audio recorder. And if that bird would be making a call, you would simultaneously pick up the vocalization. So you could say, oh, that was a Swainson's thrush, right? So there was actually some progress made at kind of interfacing these different technologies to gain a richer understanding of what species are moving and things like that, relying again on audio recordings simultaneous with the visual recordings. And we reached reasonably, there was some progress made in that, to be honest with you. But then the lead professor at Toledo moved to another university, and that part of the project kind of just disappeared. So anyway, whoever asked that question, great question, because in fact, it was something that we were actually working on 5 years ago, this interfacing of these different recording technologies, but it never reached the point of being implementable, if I could use that term.
Another question that we had was, and this is going back, I think, at the very beginning of your presentation. They were asking what would be the advantage of birds migrating parallel to the shoreline versus going across the lake? Are winds less severe? Does the land provide resting areas?
Okay, so that is an enormously interesting question. Okay, so again, because the shortest distance route would be crossing Lake Erie, right? So that, I mean, from a purely energetic perspective, why should birds avoid crossing Lake Erie? Okay. And again, it's not a huge distance, right? It's not necessarily an energetic challenge. It's 50 kilometers. Like I said, a lot of these birds are crossing the Gulf of Mexico, which is going to be probably 10 times as wide as Lake Erie, maybe even more. So the argument that we settled on is there are two reasons, right? So, the winds will be stronger over the lake. There's a reason why people want to build turbines in the lake, because you have a more consistent wind profile. But what's more likely is avoiding unpredictable, dangerous weather events. Okay. And this may seem trivial, but there are records of massive mortalities of birds that are being caught over lakes as weather systems come in, thunderstorms and things like that come in, and you have these massive mortality events. There was a mortality event of Lake Michigan in the tens of thousands of migratory birds that were killed as this weather system came in and these birds were trapped over the lake. So David Guzicki, who's given this a lot of thought, he thinks that the primary adaptive benefit of shifting your migration from crossing the lake to paralleling the lake is minimizing the risk of encountering some unexpected or unpredictable weather event that would force the animals to the ground. But if the ground is water, then it doesn't have a very happy ending. And this may be another reason also why the birds may be concentrated, because the birds do concentrate along the islands. So that would be another reason why the islands are attractive for migratory birds. Not only can they use those as a navigational device to compensate for potential wind drift, but in the event of an unexpected weather event that could cause, substantial mortality, they have a place to land. That is at water.
All right, I've got, I think, 2 more questions.
Knock yourself
and
out.
We appreciate the fact that you're staying on a little longer so we can get the questions answered.
Like I told you yesterday, I enjoy interacting with people and just sharing this. I enjoy this.
Oh, good. This was a clarifying question. In talking about adaptations to wind direction, is this based on earlier research or a new behavior observation?
Okay, I'm not sure I completely understand that question, but migratory bird researchers have spent years studying the effects of wind on the flight directions of birds. So certainly the research question, to what extent are birds drifted by the wind and not drifted by the wind, has been current in bird migration discussions, since the middle of the 20th century. So the question is not new. Okay, what we have learned over time, however, that these birds can be migratory birds. Again, these birds, and I need to emphasize, these are songbirds that are migrating at night. If I didn't make that clear, I apologize for that. But these birds are displaying increasingly clever ways to compensate for wind drift. Because again, the problem with especially side winds is it's going to result with a flight track, a movement over the ground that will substantially deviate from the heading of the bird, which is presumably its preferred direction in the absence of any kind of reference system. Okay, so we're seeing increasingly that these individual birds, despite these generalized conclusions of bird migration based on broad front analyses like those Doppler images, individual birds are these active agents, and they are incredibly clever in exploiting topographical features that can potentially be used to compensate for wind drift. Again, I'm not sure I'm answering the question, but I'm not sure I completely understood the question, but that's probably somewhere in those words I just shared with you is an answer.
All right. The last question that I have is, I guess, what is the next step in terms of this research? What would you see as the next thing you would want to do based on what you found in this research?
Okay, well, the first thing we need to do is replicate and fully analyze. So again, I need to apologize to the public that's still there, is that these data are still being analyzed. I've only showed you a small portion of the data. And so I really, the data just aren't analyzed yet. I mean, that's just the harsh reality. So the first thing is a little bit boring. We need replication. So we have one season of fall data, one season of spring data. It's a limited data set. It tells you something, but you want more. So step one would be replication, and we're doing that right now. So we are replicating the fall experiment again right now. So observations are undergoing right now. We hope to do it again in the spring. We'll see how that goes. And once we have that assembled, okay, then the next step is again trying to develop. It's not so much research based as using the accumulated data to make policy recommendations for anyone interested in any kind of Lake Erie development, whether it's wind turbines or anything else of that matter. Right. There's some obvious other things. Again, in theory, from an experimental perspective, you're only looking at, you're comparing two sites, Middle Bass Island, Bowling Green. From a purely experimental perspective, you'd like to see if the phenomena that you're seeing at these two sites generalizes to other sites. So maybe do recordings, say, on Kelly's Island and use a different site, maybe Tiffin, for example, to see if you can replicate the findings that you're getting from Middle Bass Island and Bowling Green to other areas. They'll give you more confidence that it's not a local phenomena, but a generalizable phenomena. That is potentially useful. And some of the things that were mentioned earlier, a kind of invested attempt to try to work with engineers, okay, to try to actually put a name on these observations that you're seeing. That was a Swainson's thrush. That was a warbler. That was a sparrow. All right, that would provide also all kinds of other information. And then added on to all of this is actually then correlating the flight data with the kinds of behavior, particularly habitat and the ecological aspect of this. So this is purely what I shared with you is behavioral, but there's a parallel ecological issue. These birds are landing along the coast of Lake Erie. They are landing on the islands. Okay, so how can we relate their orientation at night to perhaps microhabitat decisions and habitat distributions at these stopover sites that are so important in Northwest Ohio?
All right. Well, thank you so much. This has been such a great webinar. We really appreciate the time that you spent.
Well, again, I don't know. Let me just say goodbye to must be the thousands of people that actually listen to that, right?
I think there'll be quite a few people. I've gotten quite a few people asking for this recording. So we really appreciate all your help.
Yeah, well, if anyone out there wants, to send me a question or something like that, don't hesitate to do so. I assume my email address will be made available to people. I don't know. but I'll be happy to answer any questions that anyone might have.
All right, well, what I can do is I can add if you're okay with it, I can add your email to the email I'll send out to everyone with the recording. So if anyone has any questions, they can just email you with any follow-up questions. Is that
Absolutely.
okay?
Absolutely.
Oh, perfect. All right. All right. Well, thank you again. This has been so great. Thank you, Dr. Bingman, for your willingness to talk about your research. This was really an excellent
Right.
discussion. I'd also like to remind everyone that the survey URL for this webinar is in the chat feature, so please take a few minutes to fill that out. This webinar series is sponsored by Ohio Sea Grant and will continue in October with the University of Toledo's Tricia Sponbauer about her research on microbial communities and Lake Erie ecosystems. The registration link is in the chat. Thank you again, Dr. Bingman. This was great, and thank you all the participants on this webinar. We hope this was beneficial and hope you'll join us again in an upcoming webinar. Thank you again, Dr. Bingman. This was fantastic. We
Okay.
really appreciate it.
And my best to everyone.
All right. Have a great afternoon, everyone.